The GH5s, an amazing camera. I just pitted it up against the S5, a full-frame beast, and it did pretty well. I tested the native ISOs. I tested the highest ISOs. Well, did I actually test the native ISOs? See, a lot of people were telling me that I kind of messed that test up. You know, they were like, the native ISO isn't 400, it's 800. And I get confused because it's 400 in the other Micro Four Thirds cameras, like the GH5. You know, the natural color profiles usually have a different ISO than the Vlog because of the gamma curve and all this stuff. And I'm wondering, how is there this much confusion still? I put up a poll and nearly 50% of people are split still on if it's 400 and 2500 or if it's 800 and it's 5000. I mean, 400 makes sense, it matches the GH5. 800 and 5000 makes sense because it matches the VariCam. So what the hell is going on, and why do people not understand the ISO on this camera still after how many years since it's been released? So today, that's what we're looking at. We're taking a look at noise, maybe some dynamic range stuff, and we're talking about what is the deal with the GH5s's ISOs. So a quick comparison to keep in mind, this is the GH5 Mark II, and it has a traditional ISO that starts at the lowest, and as you increase it over time, it just gets worse and worse and worse. It ends up with worse noise overall than the GH5s for sure, but at least it's predictable and there's no random resets or anything like that. So use this as sort of a template going forward. This is Vlog way boosted and exaggerated in post. Next, let's look at the S5, and it has a very predictable noise pattern where you start at the low base ISO of 640, you go up and up and up until you reach 4000, and it has a very clear ISO noise performance reset at 4000, and then you are done. So again, this is a little bit more predictable, and this is another sort of template to use as reference for the GH5s. I think we're going to start with maybe Vlog, just because it should theoretically be a little easier to see whatever we're going to see. And then maybe later on in the video, we're going to move on to some of the, HLG, the natural, whatever. So, but yeah, let's kick it off with some Vlog footage. Vlog L, of course, not the full Vlog. So one of the things that's been weirding me out is that even if the native ISO is 800, why does it let you go down to 400? And even if it is 400, why does it go down to 320? I mean, let's just start at 320 and see what there is to see. Okay, let's just watch this kind of slowly creep up. So 320, going up to 400, which should be the native ISO. Looks about the same, a little bit noisier. 500, noisy, noisy. We keep crawling up, and then watch this, 1600. There's clearly a reset there. 2500, and then a reset at 32. 5000 seems a lot worse, and then we just keep ramping up into the insane levels of ISO, 12,800s. It's getting really, really noisy. It's going to be unusable way up here. So here's the big thing. Here's a side-by-side image of ISO 400 and ISO 800, the two alleged native ISOs. And as you can see, 800 at 400% zoom, it's way noisier. Let's jump up to the 2500 versus 5000 ISO. Now, this one's a little closer than you might think, but to my eye, 2500 certainly looks better for color noise than 5000. So I'm just going to say it right now. I think that the idea that the base ISOs in Vlog is 800 and 5000 is just busted. I think it's clearly a lot closer to 400 and 2500 as advertised, but that gives me some questions about the other color profiles, which we're going to look into later. And it also makes me wonder what was going on with those resets, and let's look at some other weird stuff I found during that test. So surprise number one with this test is just how bad ISO 1000 and 1250 are. I would say these are among the worst ISOs on the camera. I would, in vlog anyway, I would definitely try to avoid these two ISOs at all costs. The other would have to be the weird resets. So 320 is one of the, if not the cleanest ISO on the camera, not 400, which is supposed to be the base ISO. And then there's a pretty clear reset, at least to my eyes, at 1600 and 3200, with those being other clear winners for ISO performance. So I think what's happening here is that the GH5s does have a native ISO of 400 and 2500, but the camera is allowing you to dip down just a little bit to ISO 320 or ISO 2500 or 1600 just to get a little bit cleaner images. In fact, I've talked to a few Panasonic people that have sort of confirmed this, saying that because the dynamic range, the highlight roll-off of the GH5s is better than the regular GH5, for example, that dipping down just like a third of a stop or 2/3 of a stop under the base/native ISO gives you still enough highlights and cleaner images that could be useful in other situations. So I guess for vlog, if you want the cleanest, absolute cleanest images, 320, 1600, that's where you want to go. If you want the best balance, I think 400 and 2500 will give you a little bit more shadow noise, but will overall give you better dynamic range in like really high contrast, high intensity dynamic range situations. I can't really explain that jump at 3200. I think that might just be some, processing kicking in the camera, but unclear at this point. So yeah, if you want the ultimate best noise performance, 320, 1600, 3200, there are some kind of resets, whether that's electronic or image processing or whatever. Those seem to be pretty clean for whatever reason. Okay, so now that we've tested some of the vlog and that sort of footage, I think we really need to test the, natural HLG CineD, because if you look at the S5, for example, you get a lot of, different native ISOs for those different profiles, just like we talked about in the recent video with, the S series and how their native ISO works. And we're going to take a look and see if the GH5s is closer to like the GH5. We're going to look to see if it's closer to like the S5 or even the VariCam line. So yeah, let's see what some of those other color profiles have to offer us. Oh God, what a terrible line reading. I'm not doing it again though. So natural starts at 160, which is half of the vlog lowest ISO, which gives us a hint already. But it's really clean here. A little bit less clean at 200, and I'm not going to put the numbers, but we just ramp up and up and up, and then at 800, there's a reset. And it goes up again from 800, up, and then 1600, there's a reset. And then from here, it just ramps up like before. So this gives us some interesting hints at what we're going to discuss when it comes to the final results in a minute. CineD starts at the same place, 160, and 200's about the same. It climbs up until a very similar reset at 800, and then honestly, 800 slowly increasing all the way up to like, I'll point it out when it happens, but 3, 2, 1, 8,000. Until you reach 8,000, CineD is really similar in that range from like 800 all the way to 6,400. There's barely any change, which is interesting, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Looking at HLG, we start at 320, move up to 400, which is a little bit noisier. Pretty noisy right off the bat here, actually, and we just slowly creep up, reset at 1600, reset at 3200, and all the way up to 8,000 is pretty similar, and then 10,000 it starts to creep in. And you might be noticing that these extreme high ISOs are actually way cleaner than even the base ISOs, which is a little odd to say the least. I got a few notes here I'm going to read to you guys. We got natural, looks like 160, 800, 1600. Definitely seem to be the resets, which is half of V-Log, which does imply to me that the natural profile, standard profile, all that stuff acts pretty similarly to how it would act in the GH5 or GH4, where it's half of the ISO of V-Log, which makes sense, and I'm glad it's consistent like that. You move over to CineD, which, if you remember from the S5 tests, is actually different ISO values for the native ISO values in that camera and the S series, but looks like on the GH5s, it's 160, 800 to 6400 is very similar, and then it's pretty much good till 12,800, 16,000. Yeah, essentially, CineD is kind of in line with most of the other profiles. So one thing about CineD is that fact that the ISO the noise barely changes from 800 all the way up to 6400, and even then, like I said, it's good up to 12,800. So yeah, it's really strange how the ISO barely changes the noise. Moving on to HLG, looks like this follows more of the V-Log format ISO, just like some of the other cameras. So the ISO here, 320 is the lowest and the best. 800 seems to not be as similar as some of the other ones, but 1600, 3200 again, they seem to be what you're going to want to use. And 3200 to 8000, essentially the same. Again, barely any change, just like CineD. So what's going on there? Who knows? You get up to like 16,000, it looks really bad. And I would say HLG overall is noisier than pretty much any other profile. Honestly, HLG looks pretty fantastic when exposed properly at 320, 1600, or 3200. So to really show the difference, I boosted the shadows by like 5 stops, zoomed in 400%, and looked in this super dark corner. And the results bear true. 3200 and 1600 are definitely way cleaner than the lower ISOs like 320 all the way up to 1250, which are all pretty noisy for how low they are. So there's some weird stuff going on with HLG. There you have it. What do you guys think about the split diopter shot, by the way? Am I even in focus? I tried to do better. I know the shot earlier wasn't as good. Anyway, back to the rest of the video. I'm still not 100% sure on some of the stuff like the highlights and things like that, but it seems pretty clear to me that it does have a similar ISO to maybe the GH5, where the V-Log's 400 or 320 maybe, and then you get a lower ISO with some of the other stuff. But it's not quite that easy either, because if you sort of think about it, it can go a little bit lower, and it's when you go under the ISO of like 400 or under ISO 2500, it's a little cleaner. So it definitely seems like a version of the extended ISO that you can put in the GH5 or the S series cameras that takes you under the native ISO and really kills your highlights. It doesn't seem to kill the highlights that much on this camera, which is good, but it seems like Panasonic Panasonic thought that was an acceptable trade-off, and that it was easily allowable to get the cleanest images at the lowest ISO possible, and the highlight roll-off wasn't a big deal just because of how much dynamic range the sensor has already. And so there's a lot going on here, but this is the closest I've seen anyone getting to the answers of the base ISO, and I might cut this part, but Panasonic has told me itself that none of their cameras outside the VariCam line have that 800, 5000 ISO, and they said officially that 400, 2500 is the base ISOs for this camera. So yeah, there you have it. I think that's about as definitive as we're going to get in this video without going super crazy or getting really scientific. But hopefully this helped you understand the ISO on this camera a little bit, because I feel like a lot of people have been using the ISO a little bit wrong on this camera up until this point, which is interesting. But it's so good at every ISO pretty much, besides that weird 1250. I can't believe how bad 1250 is. Especially because that was one of the better ISOs on the GH5 from my memory. But yeah, now you know. And keep this stuff in mind. If you need the ultimate clean images, 320, 2000. If you want the base ISOs, the best overall mix, maybe that would be considered the native ISO. 400, 2500. Those are the numbers for sure. And, just take all that with a grain of salt. And then also really realize that every ISO is great on this camera. It's all really solid until you get up to the, past 12,000 range. And at that point, you're in a desperate situation anyway if you're shooting like that. So, yeah, interesting little camera. But, yeah, thanks for stopping by. Hope this helped you out. And we'll see you guys in the next video. Feel free to subscribe. It's a good time here. We have a good time. I got lots of stuff coming up. We're going to do some S-series stuff. This is the Leica 25-50. We got a review coming out on that. And then I might do a review on both those lenses as like a set. I think it could be really fun. But yeah, hopefully you like this video. Subscribe. Check out my Patreon. I have a Patreon now. Get some,